I'd like everybody to give Marc a big round of applause. Thanks for coming to Knoxville.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for taking the time. Promise not to keep you too long from your coffee and ice cream. I have priorities too. I want to thank the chapter, obviously, for the invitation, in particular John, and as always, John and Brandon for their friendship, and Adam for the introduction, and Haynes for the sponsorship. Really appreciate that, and congratulations to you. Frank sends his love. Tornadoes got the airport in Arkansas, and it's a long drive, so he wishes he could have been here. Follow us on Instagram, very important. That's the marketing slide. This is for Frank in particular, because I heard this is going to be recorded. This is how we imagine our partnership in many ways. We see ourselves as a bit of a dynamic duo. Note the symmetry here and the passive-aggressive competitiveness, which I think is the great ingredient of any partnership. But in a way, this is the kind of duo that we really aspire to be. This, of course, is the Heart Foundation for all the professional wrestling fans in the audience. We like to think of our practice as a bit of a mix of kind of athleticism and endurance, performance art, and very distinct personalities unified by a bit of artifice, which we think is a great way to think about architectural practice. In particular, Frank and I are both professors. He's at University of Arkansas still, and I'm at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And our body of work is really seamlessly moves between activities of building, teaching, and research. And we sort of talk about those things almost equally in our daily conversations. And really, each informs the other, which is really important to our approach. This is where we've been. I'm from Ohio, Canton in particular, but spent most of my time in Cleveland, which is where I started Silo one day after I got my architectural registration. To me, it was really important, even though I didn't have any work, to sort of announce that I wanted to aspire to do something on my own. Quickly thereafter, I relocated to Arkansas, where Frank and I were hired together at the same time. I think it was Marlon's idea to pit us against each other. If you guys know Marlon Blackwell, that probably makes sense. But we quickly bonded over our mutual love of Charles Moore and formed our partnership from there. So we really got going with the practice in 2012, and I've since relocated to Charlotte, where we're working today. So it's kind of great to be here in Knoxville that's part of this kind of Bermuda Triangle of design in the U.S. A unifying theme in our work is really that we've had to operate in everywhere we practice on projects that are extremely resourceful, or you could say inexpensive in another way, either with a lack of big budgets or a lack of really quality construction or not a lot of time. And in some ways, the logic between those three, as we know, structures any kind of idea about project delivery. But we think of our work as trying to basically rethink the relationship between those things and sort of, pursue the impossible middle of this diagram. And so getting back to Charles Moore, we tend to think about our work as, through this logic of resourcefulness, really finding a way to do interesting or revolutionary things sort of with what's available at any given time. So we like this, this idea of using cheap tricks and cheap pieces in some ways to put things together. Not unlike one of my favorite songs, Johnny Cash's cover of One Piece at a Time. I think there's a bit of the ethos in this project as he goes from 51, 52, 53 that finds its way into a lot of our work. And so some of our early experiments together were about this. This was an installation project that we did at the University of Arkansas where we harvested wood off an old barn and to do an installation that was about the falling barns of the Ozarks. And we used high-tech tools and parametric design to sort of understand the available barnwood that we had for the project and sort of rethink the form and shape of it based on what we had. So we sort of scanned the wood and cut it down into nominal strips, and then we had our students zip tie it together, literally one piece at a time. So on the one side it looks like a gambrel, and on the other side it sort of looks as though it's coming apart in suspended animation. And in some ways we like this idea of using high-tech tools and sort of almost Fordist construction practices in order to make something which is visually complex. We like the relationship between cost, quality, and time in particular because, as we know, it structures the relationship between us, our clients, and the contractors. And whenever you're working in a way that you want something that is complex or sophisticated or even well-crafted, and you don't have a lot of resources, you sort of have to give up on we think you have to give up or expand upon or even multiply the idea of authorship in the project. And that's something that we've really thought about, the way that we could sort of expand and bring in new audiences for the design and development and even reception of our work. And this is something that we really, I think, learned a lot from this drawing from the Eames office, where they talk about their design process is the intersection of their interests, their client's interest, and really the public interest at the same time. And this is something that we've played with really in the kind of democratization of the way that you would conventionally think of an architect as the sole author of a project, and really tried to bring more people in. This is a little installation piece competition that we won for a temporary memorial for the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. This was actually on display at the AIA convention a couple years ago. So we were interested in how the design of the piece would actually be really ephemeral, almost light and in some ways non-existent, and then the way that the people would experience the memorial would somehow create the visual or spatial effect of it. So we mounted one for each of the victims, a little bubble gun that could be pressed, and then we had this iris that we made that you could blow a bubble, so to speak, in memory of somebody that was lost. And the effect ended up being pretty dramatic. And I think, you know, it's hard to find joy sometimes in tragic events, but we think that this project did a little bit of that. The other audience that we think is really important, even though you're sort of in the muck and the mess of a project, is great architects sort of understand their place within the field of architecture. So Charles Jenks, as you all know, recently passed away, and in his language of postmodernism, you may not like the results of the work, but what he was talking about is something that resonates with us a lot, where you need to sort of have every move or every design decision or every sort of project speaks to two registers, one which is kind of popular, even lay audience, the public, and the other is architects talking amongst ourselves. And we really love his evolutionary charts that he did that sort of tell the story of 20th century and 21st century architecture as a series of evolving movements. and show how architects fit into those. And that's something that we're very self-conscious about in our own work, where we've tried to understand our own projects in relationship to those that influence us, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. And that's something that's really important. How does our work sort of fit within the discipline? And a lot of these, if you study them pretty closely, these are architects that tend not to be talked about together. And so Frank and I tend to be very promiscuous in the sources that we look for. And equally so, this is for Frank, he would be really pissed if I didn't plug his book, which I've heard some of you have, called Archographic, which is another way of looking at the field of architecture as a culture in and of itself. So this is telling the story of architecture through the colors that architects use, which is something that you wouldn't typically consider. And I think Frank's first personal favorite is this chart, which talks about when architects were born, when they graduated, when they got married, when they got divorced, when they got married, when they got divorced, and when they died. And so in a way, you wouldn't think of that life cycle making sense, but when you start to put it all together, it gives you a sense of where you are in relationship to other folks that you admire, and tells you whether you need to speed up or slow down in a way, or get divorced. The other thing that I would say is a unifying principle for us is no excuses in our work, that we feel that every project, regardless of the client or the budget or no budget in a lot of instances, that everybody should get a chance to experience great architecture. And so this comes, I don't know if you guys know this is Philip Johnson's 7 Crutches of Modern Architecture that he delivered to the students at Harvard in 1943, effectively attacking all the Bauhaus, late Bauhaus stuff that was going on there at the time. And he basically said, yeah, you can't make excuses for, we've all done it. Don't have enough money, crappy client, too much baggage, bad consultants, all those things. But in some ways, great architecture should persist through all that. And I think that's an ethical thing that we definitely operate in. And this is actually from the AIA's Code of Ethics. That is I teach professional practice as well at my school, so I have to teach the Code of Ethics to them as well. And this is something that I think we forget about sometimes, about the standard of excellence that's expected of us to advance the art of architecture in our work. All right, so on to some projects here. This is our first project. It was a small church that we did in Cleveland. The client was, it was basically a service mission that operated off of donations and things like that. And the Reverend reached out to some of my former teachers at Ohio State, asking for the Cleveland equivalent of Sam Mockbee, and somehow they thought of me. I don't know. It didn't. So anyway, that's how we got the job, and they were in this great old building on the left that they couldn't afford to be in anymore. So we needed to move, and we finally found them a spot just right down the street in this old shoe factory where they are co-located. It's a Presbyterian church in a Lutheran building with a primarily Baptist congregation. So figure that one out. But yeah, they got the first floor, about 5,000 feet of a 50,000 square foot project. And then there's a little portion of the church within the larger mission. So the design challenge came to be, how do we capture the qualities of their old sanctuary in a much shallower space? And so we kind of thought about this kind of smashed version of the Air Force Chapel in a way. Like, how do you create the same sort of spirit and symmetry and qualities of light and sort of spatial effects in 14 feet of clear section versus what Netch had about 50 feet. And so what we began with is looking at the existing structure that we had to keep as much of because we didn't have much money to build this thing. And we sort of vacuum formed the ceiling to what was there. So in some ways, we didn't compose it very much, and we let the existing building dictate a lot. The other thing that we had is the deal that the church cut with the Lutheran ministry that was there, that was mostly social service stuff, is that during the week, the sanctuary had to serve as multi-function space, not unlike this, with those beautiful moving partitions back there. And then on the weekend, it would serve as a church. So in the section, we sort of had two datums, one which was the existing structure, the higher one, and then the lower one was the height of the moving partitions. And that dictated a lot. The ceiling became clear that the ceiling was going to be the main design element in the project, and in a way, when you think of sanctuary spaces throughout history, most of the time you think of dramatic volumes that draw your eye upward. We knew that we wanted to introduce some visual complexity on the ceiling, so we developed a pattern that was made out of, I think, 8 different triangles that would repeat, but that wouldn't look like they repeat. The colors on the ceiling were a direct copy from the stained glass windows that were in the old sanctuary, and the white ones are where the sprinkler heads went. And they offered us a way to get a little bit more ambient light deeper into the volume. So it became a series of vaults, more or less, that were interconnected. The other thing that was incredibly awful about the project is it was delivered CM at risk, which for those of you that know, it was also GMP after schematic design. So we didn't have, isn't that the best? So we knew that the contractor was going to do whatever possible to value engineer the ceiling. That was going to be the first thing to go. So what we did is we attempted to make it change order resistant. And in the spec, we told the contractor, don't call us if you run into a problem, just make more triangles. And we looked at Saul LeWitt for a little bit of direction in his wall drawings. And in fact, it kind of worked out because, as most of you know, when you send interns out to do field measurements, there are often errors. And this column was, in fact, an error. And as you can see, these are, in a way, the contractor at this moment is becoming the author of the design. They didn't call us, they just sort of made the triangles move around the column, and it worked out. The ceiling itself is made of green skate-like material. It's the stuff they use in skateboard ramps. It's really cheap, and it's half brown, half black. So when you cut a router through it, it basically has integral reveals in it, which sort of works itself out. And then we put all the light fixtures and things like that in the cracks. And then the other sort of black reveals are where the tracks are hidden for the moving partitions. I got to go faster. So there it is in meeting mode, and there it is in sanctuary mode, same view. So we wanted it to look finished regardless of the mode that it was in. And then here it is looking back at the entry. We didn't want to do a traditional on-axis entry because a lot of the congregation are sort of homeless and ex-cons and things like that, and they're coming to church with a lot of humility. And so we put the entrance actually sort of at the back corner in the sanctuary. And you can see here the relationship between the old structure and the new. This is an existing sprinkler pipe that ran through that we just sort of bent the ceiling around. And this is how we tend to work. After we're done, we sort of imagine new possibilities for our projects that help influence other things. Next project, also in Cleveland. This was a small design build competition that we did for the Cleveland Botanical Garden that we won. It was for a tree house, and the first thing you'll notice about this site is no trees. And so that became a lot of the design challenge. The other design challenge is they wanted us, it's in a manicured garden, and they gave us no laydown area. So we had to build the thing completely off-site, and the client, despite the fact that they gave us only $10,000 and 10 weeks to do this project, was incredibly difficult to work for. So we began with a kind of imagined floating house, kind of a child's view of a tree house. And we thought about what it meant that it was in this courtyard, in the formal garden. And we also thought about how, even if a child or somebody couldn't climb up inside of it, how could they still enjoy the experience? So the house form, as we started to manipulate it, actually became like a periscope. And so we thought about mirroring the interior as a way to draw the surrounding botanical garden down into the space. And like I said, we had it fabricated. We fabricated it, except for the steel frame. And so we did some really elaborate drawings for it. And ultimately, the manufacturer, the steel guy said, "Can you just send us a physical model?" So if you look here, there's a little model. Because they told us our drawings were terrible. And so they as well, they added some more rods into the structure based on what they thought worked. And then we came in afterwards and added the exterior panel that was laminated with mirrored mylar. This image is blurry to conceal the guilty. We were not approved to use a crane to deliver this, and I had it on the crane the day before the show was supposed to open, and the client told me, did we validate the structure? Would it affect their parking, this, that, and the other? And the crane guy told me if I took it off, he's going to charge me $5,000. And I said, I told the client that, and I said, hey, do you guys allow fire trucks to pull up to the front of your building and put out fires? They said, we sure do. I said, well, a fire truck weighs more and has less wheels than my crane, so I think you're going to be okay. And they said, no. And I called the crane guy back, and he said, what should we do? I said, how early can you be there? And there it is, open. Client actually held money back from us, but the piece was there and open for the garden show, for the summer garden show, and they actually set attendance records at the Cleveland Botanical Garden that summer. So no good deed goes unpunished, I guess. But this is the piece, so you can see it's another one of these projects which is sort of consistent with us. We want to create sort of radical change in the form and space of the project, even on something small. Effectively, the longer you experience it, the more interest you have in it, rather than a project where you look at it once and go, I get it. And so you could see the way the kids dangerously occupy this thing. These were not staged kids. I don't have any kids. Yeah, they were really having a good time with it the day the photographer came out. But you can see how the visual effect works. It's kind of like it's a bit of a fun house once you get inside of it. But in a way, the qualities of the architecture really change once you get inside of it. It looks solid at some points and then really opens up on the interior and almost disappears in a way. So this is the view from the garden out to the forest, and then here's the view back from the garden towards it. So the height of the courtyard walls became the sort of base of the design in a way where it looks almost like it's floating above the walls from certain vantage points. This is our first project that we did in Arkansas. This is a house that we call Mood Ring, which will become very apparent. It began as a issue in economics. How do we build a really inexpensive house on a very particular and unique site near downtown Fayetteville? And what can you do basically in a project that would allow something inexpensive to almost have multiple sort of lives or multiple experiences? So we wanted a house that would change from day to night, and we wanted a house that in that change would almost reveal a secret hidden life. So this is what we built this for. I built a lot of it myself, but we started the design with looking at the foundation, which is expensive in the clay in Arkansas. And so the narrow base made sense, and the cantilevered top made sense to deal with the slope of the site and really take advantage of the landscape that was there and the sort of trees on site. So we did just sort of conventional, relatively common sense things like co-locating utilities, using standard modules, and sort of finding ways to leverage the structure of the upper level to support the cantilevers. It's a live-work house. The first floor is work. The second floor is live. Sort of a loft, an urban house in a not-so-urban place, we like to say. The rotation on the site, if you can see that down below, is really genuflecting to the streets that meet in the odd corner that's at this location. And this is the panel we used. When I first got to Arkansas, sorry, this is a little bit of a digression. I was hired by Marlon Blackwell, who was the department chair, and he told me how much he hated vinyl windows and hardy panel and conventional materials. And so I made sure that whenever we built our first house there, we used all those things. So this was pre-finished hardy panel that we put up like concrete. So we wanted concrete board to actually look like concrete. We broke our own trims for it, made out a galvanized flash from Home Depot, and all the windows are vinyl patio doors. This is the view from the backyard, so you can see the highfalutin context there. That's actually half on the property and half off the property, the shed back there. But you can see the way that the house really perches up and becomes part of the trees in the backyard, and you can reach out from the bedrooms that are up there and touch the birds if you'd like. This is the view from the north. You can see there's a continual clear story up at the top, which makes sense. That's polycarbonate. And the soffits themselves are polycarbonate as well. And the rotation allowed us to have an entry on the side, which made sense. So it really is a sort of Hansel and Gretel entrance that takes you from the neighborhood to the house. This is along that north-facing edge. It's a slice that gets that nice north light to sort of come deeper into the house. If you look at the ceiling pitch, we actually we had the roof truss person just design it upside down. So the top chord of the shed roof is the sort of typically the bottom chord of a normal gable. And this is the bedroom where you could see that slope a little bit more and start to get a sense of the quality of that space. That space is 12 foot by 12 foot by 12 foot to where right before it kicks up. So the double life, or the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of the house, when we started to imagine what it could be, we didn't want to build anymore. So we thought about using light, which we had just done on a small installation piece that we did in St. Louis. And we thought about the idea that the house could sort of author its own architecture. And we thought about a way to do that would be sort of taking its own temperature and projecting it out on its exterior. So we developed a system of sensors that we put around the house to sort of capture the local temperature at that spot. And we had two settings, one where it could kind of like tell you the local temperature of in the house on the outside, or sort of average it together in one color. Also, my wife had an app on her phone where she could just push a button and make it whatever color she wanted. So I knew if it was red, I was in trouble. But the effect, this is the house effectively from the entry path during the day. So it's when you're there, it's very demure, even though it's got a kind of macho section to it. It really recedes. And then at night, the transformation starts to happen, and this is sort of that average mode, and that's actually me at the front door trying to get in. And then once the sun sets, what became interesting is the sort of figure ground reversal that happens. And we were interested in the way that architects typically deploy the color changing LED thing. It's kind of a cheap trick or a sort of surface effect. And we wanted to see if we could make volumes of space out of it. And so I think we got pretty close on this one. But the figure ground of the house sort of reverses, and it looks like almost like a poor man's minimalist colored art installation. And that is the view from the north face at night. The question that we most of the time get about the house is, did your neighbors hate it? When we turn the lights on. And I think they may have. But we did notice that people started to put colored porch lights on their front porches after that. So we like to think that we were a little ahead of the curve on creating a rainbow light district in South Fayetteville, Arkansas. We took this idea at an urban scale in Charlotte for a proposal that we made with a developer to purchase some city-owned land for a multifamily project. Belmont's the neighborhood. It exists between Uptown Charlotte and Plaza Midwood, if you know the neighborhood. The red speck there is where it is. This is a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood that was predominantly African-American residents after the first generation of millhouse owners moved out. And now it's becoming a place that is having some really aggressive real estate transition. And so this is the local site. The city owned 2 pieces of land. There were 2 existing buildings on them that they wanted to keep. And they wanted us to do something that would sort of relate to the neighborhood in a literal and economic way, which was the real possibility for the project, which we thought that's why it interested us. When I moved to Charlotte, it was right after the Keith Lamont Scott shooting and protests, and I'm sure you guys heard about those. They were pretty infamous. This is a really great shot, and that is Braxton Winston, who is currently one of our councilmen. So he went from this moment to getting involved and trying to become part of the solution, which I think is really amazing. So the impetus for our development project was to do something that was affordable or below market rate, and that would somehow open up back to the community in Belmont. So we developed a scheme that had different scales of entry into it for local businesses that wanted to open up there, and also for residents to move into it. The way that we did that was to put a lot of density on site at a relatively humane scale, and also to take common spaces and designate them as neighborhood amenity spaces. So instead of us putting more parking on it, we basically turned the limited amount of parking that was there into public space. And the reason we could get away with the limited parking on site is because the site is really interconnected to all the public transit that Charlotte offers, including the sort of newish light rail. In terms of the housing, our strategy was this developer was not altruistic. They wanted to make money. And so the strategy that we came up with was to do market rate micro units and do subsidized 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms. And they did the numbers on it based on the amount of units that we had, and they thought that would totally work. And we knew that we needed an angle on the community and public space in order for the city to award us the project. We were ultimately the runner-up. But our plan was to use the existing and new buildings as almost like a frame against really vibrant public spaces that were the residual. We really were driven by the pro forma on the project, as most of you that do sort of multifamily and mixed use know. The city wanted us to really activate the site quickly, so phase 1 was renovate the existing buildings and add some pop-up space for local businesses to effectively incubate on site, and use the open space between to host a series of public and community events. The second phase was to add the first housing project that would sort of work on the smaller site, and then third, sort of moving back over to put in the larger building. We didn't maximize the amount of units that the code offered basically in order to maintain a little, let's say, more domestic scale, because it's mostly houses around the property. The architectural strategy became about creating a flexible podium and then looking at this sort of layering between the perimeter and the interior, getting more active as you moved internally. And you could see that a little bit better maybe in this section perspective, where the veils on the outside were meant to sort of make it appear fuzzy and a little less big. And then on the inside, the circulation was a kind of semi-public zone that would look out onto the AGORA, and there would be a lot of walkways and things that would sort of connect residents down into that space. In order to make the spaces active, we were thinking about the way that murals are being used on a lot of buildings right now, and we thought about the idea of a dynamic mural using lights. And so we studied the ways with the geometry that we were proposing and the structural logic of it all to light the surface in different ways that would sort of change based on event or based on the amount of use, and even we were talking with them about the sort of thermal mapping idea as well. And so you can get a sense of the possibilities. And so a couple of these images give you an idea about how those spaces might look and feel if we would have got the chance to build them. The city, in their infinite wisdom, picked a scheme that had no housing. We have no idea why. That council person is no longer there. And so, yeah, here's a sort of aerial view that gives you a sense of that, the relationship between the new and old buildings. So again, it was kind of not quite maximizing the site, but really trying to find a way to frame that interior space. Back to Arkansas, this is a house that was really all about its site. It's in the Ozark Mountains, actually overlooking the Boston Mountains to the south. The house became about just sort of adapting the shape to the site and capitalizing on the views to create a kind of abstract, artificial kind of geological shape. And so there were views near and far that we wanted to capture, spaces near and far that we wanted to capture, and the sort of transition between the distant views and the immediate forest created this interesting tension, we think, between the interior rooms and the exterior mass. And so you could see how it sits on the site, and you could see a glimpse of how it peeks out over the mountains to the south. Again, it's a project that really changes as you move around it. So the front face and the terraces open up from the living space in the master bedroom to the mountains. As we turn the corner and head up the hill, it starts to sort of step. And the interior configuration is a split level that effectively adapts therein. So you can see that view sort of day and night. This was, if the Mood Ring House was our rainbow project, this was our white on white Robert Ryman project. And you can see the shape really changes from thick to thin in different levels of open and enclosed. As you move around it, there's off the kitchen, a terrace that opens up into the woods. No, there are not elephants in the Ozarks. This was one of our interns being playful, I think. But what looks like a solid chunk actually starts to delaminate up at the entry and pull away to sort of become a mask. And in between that surface is actually an oculus that sits just off the entry that gives you a little glimpse of the sky before you head indoors. Inside, there's a long stair that sort of stitches all those different rooms and split-level spaces together. That's the spine of the house. And then here you can see, as you move up into the living space, the different views, this one from the living, and then back out into the woods through the kitchen. And then looking up from the landing down through the sort of layering that's happening. The ladder came after, just so you guys know, after we got our C of O. But yeah, that's a study for writing and reading. And then up in the master suite is where you get the best views out to the mountains. So each of these spaces in some ways has a unique scale and character and quality, which is something we wanted in a relatively kind of singular architecture. And then there it is at night. This is the last project. It's called the Heads House. It's in Goshen, Arkansas. This was a house that was on it's a fairly generic site, but it's in the middle of between kind of Arkansas chicken houses and suburban buildings and a few sort of vernacular things that the clients were really attracted to. And what the project became about sort of how do you capture some of the qualities of those buildings for a design that was for folks that were aging in place. And so the scheme became two separate masses, one single story that they would live in most of the time, and then a second that was two stories that was more of a service and guest space. In the lower scheme, what we tried to do is it's sort of a continuous bar, but we wanted it to feel like separate rooms in the enfilade sequence, so we varied the vaulting that happens. The real driver of the shapes, though, was the client's father was a sculptor, and these head sculptures have been part of their collection and their family for over 50 years, and they were really inspired by them, and when we saw them, we were really inspired by them, and we wanted to create a sort of place for memory in the house, and so we looked at each face as each end of the bars as a kind of abstracted interpretation of these sculptural heads. So you can kind of see that in the drawings. So this is the front facade as you approach. Very sort of conventional materials, the same roof that they use on the chicken houses. And this is actually Hardy Shake that was painted red, which was an absolute client demand. But we like the fact that it sort of references the context without being, let's say, as nostalgic as others might be about it. At night, you could see the way the volumes sort of tilt and twist, and we use the lighting to sort of accentuate that movement as it moves around. Again, I think it's a rather surprising rear elevation that looks out to the trees that frame the property. And then one of our favorite ends, the red arrow. You enter between the volumes into this sort of passage that looks again out to the property. And then this is a series of sections cut through that long and low bar, showing you the different vaults, and they actually don't relate to the outside gable at all. So it's a bit of asymmetry in the otherwise symmetrical envelope. And so this is a series of sequence of spaces that walk you through. Again, this was another economically done project that we designed and built very quickly. And then here's the first view, sort of looking down that volume, so you can see the vaults are, Frank and I talked a lot about adicula as we were designing this. And then we won't tell you if this was a mistake, but we like it. And yeah, that's the last project. I really appreciate your attention. This was really fun. Thank you.